Remember the panicked, high-pitched squeaks of Beaker? The eager, breathless voice of Scooter rushing backstage? The cynical, booming laugh of Statler from the balcony? You grew up on that sound. It was the sound of pure, innocent childhood joy. But the man making those sounds was living a nightmare. His name was Richard Hunt. While Hollywood was busy selling families a beautiful message of love and acceptance, they were hiding a dark, terrible secret. The man bringing those puppets to life was a gay man dying of AIDS. To the studio executives, his illness was just a threat to their toy sales. They forced him to keep his suffering completely hidden to protect their billion-dollar brand. They let the puppets live forever, but they completely erased the human being who gave them a soul, leaving him to fade away in the dark. This is the true story of how Hollywood hid a devastating plague right behind the smiling faces of the Muppets. Richard Hunt was born on the 17th of August, 1951, in the Bronx, New York, before his family relocated to the quiet, structured suburbs of Gloucester, New Jersey. From the moment he could walk and talk, he was a human hurricane. He was the second of 5 children, but in any room he occupied, he was the absolute center of gravity. While millions of children and adults would eventually know his voice through iconic Muppet characters like Scooter, Beaker, and Statler, almost no one knew the man holding the puppet. He was a master of hiding in plain sight. Growing up in the 1950s and 60s, the American suburbs demanded conformity. You were expected to fit neatly into a predetermined mold. Richard simply could not. He possessed a frantic, brilliant, and deeply disruptive energy. He was a natural prankster, a relentless extrovert, and a boy who used volume and humor as both a weapon and a shield. For a young, closeted gay man coming of age in an era that viewed homosexuality with intense suspicion and hostility, comedy was the ultimate defensive strategy. If you keep everyone laughing, they rarely look close enough to see the cracks in the armor. His intellect was sharp, but traditional schooling bored him. He was a teenager heavily influenced by the shifting cultural tides of the late 1960s, drawn to the rebellious energy of rock and roll, the theatricality of the stage, and the chaotic freedom of New York City, which lay just across the George Washington Bridge. He took on odd jobs after high school, performing in local theater, doing a stint as a radio weather reporter, and searching for an outlet massive enough to contain his personality. He didn't want to just be an actor. He wanted to orchestrate chaos. In 1970, barely out of high school at the age of 18, Richard made a decision that sounds entirely fictional, but is completely true. Standing on a street corner, he dropped a coin into a public payphone and dialed the number for Jim Henson Associates. He had no formal training in professional puppetry. He didn't have an agent. He just had an unshakable, audacious belief that he belonged in their room. When the receptionist answered, Richard didn't ask for an application. He asked for a job. He bluffed, charmed, and fast-talked his way into securing a face-to-face audition with Jim Henson himself. The meeting between Henson and Hunt is a study in profound contrasts. Jim Henson was famously quiet, a gentle, bearded visionary who rarely raised his voice and communicated through subtle nods and murmurs. Richard Hunt kicked the door off its hinges. He was loud, physically imposing, and vibrated with a frantic, nervous energy. Yet Henson possessed a genius for recognizing raw, untamed talent. He looked past the bravado and saw a young man with flawless comedic timing and an instinctive understanding of physical comedy. Henson hired him almost immediately. Richard started at the absolute bottom. He was the guy sweeping the floors, fetching the coffee, and doing background manipulation, controlling the right arm of a puppet while a senior performer operated the head and mouth. Puppetry at the Jim Henson Company was not child's play. It was a grueling, highly technical, and physically punishing discipline. Performers spent hours crouched under tables, their arms raised rigidly above their heads, their necks craned backward to watch their performance on a television monitor mounted on the floor. Everything you did with your hand had to be reversed in your brain, acting through a lens you couldn't directly see. It caused severe muscle cramps, ruined joints, and demanded intense psychological focus. For Richard, this physical confinement was bizarrely liberating. By hiding his physical body below the frame of the camera, his outsized personality was finally free to explode through the felt. He absorbed the technical skills with terrifying speed. He learned how to make a piece of foam breathe, how to make a pair of ping-pong ball eyes look genuinely heartbroken, and how to snap a puppet's jaw to deliver a punchline with deadly accuracy. By the mid-1970s, as Henson was developing the Muppet Show, Richard had transitioned from an eager rookie to one of the 5 core performers, standing shoulder to shoulder with legends like Frank Oz and Jerry Nelson. He was the youngest of the central group, and he brought a rock and roll anarchy to the studio that the others fed off entirely. His most defining early character was Scooter, the eager, fast-talking, slightly neurotic backstage gopher who was constantly trying to keep the chaotic theater running. Scooter was not just a character, he was an almost direct avatar of Richard's own early days at the company. Scooter was the guy with the clipboard, the young upstart who knew exactly how the machine worked and wasn't afraid to insert himself into the middle of the madness. Richard gave Scooter a breathless, rapid-fire voice that perfectly mirrored the manic energy of a young man desperate to prove his worth in a room full of giants. He also began taking on secondary roles that showcased his incredible range. He gave voice to Statler, the cynical old man in the balcony, channeling a biting, sarcastic wit that offset the show's inherent sweetness. He voiced Janice, the spaced-out Valley Girl lead guitarist of the Electric Mayhem, proving he could master laid-back coolness just as easily as frantic panic. He even provided the original gruff caveman-like voice for a red monster on Sesame Street named Elmo, years before the puppet was handed over to Kevin Clash and reinvented. Richard Hunt was no longer the restless kid from New Jersey. By his mid-20s, he was a millionaire maker. He was an integral, irreplaceable engine in a massive, globally beloved television franchise. He was traveling to London to film The Muppet Show, rubbing shoulders with the biggest celebrities on the planet and pouring his absolute soul into characters that were becoming permanent fixtures in the cultural consciousness. On the surface, it was the ultimate success story. A kid with too much energy and a massive dream had conquered the entertainment world. He had found his tribe, his purpose, and a brilliant platform for his unique brand of genius. By the late 1970s, Richard Hunt had achieved a bizarre kind of global fame. He was completely ubiquitous and entirely invisible. The Muppet Show was broadcast in over 100 countries. It was a cultural juggernaut. Every week, millions of families gathered around their televisions to watch the meticulously orchestrated mayhem. Hunt was at the absolute center of it. He was operating Scooter, bringing a frantic, nervous energy to the backstage scenes. He was giving voice to Beaker's high-pitched shrieks of scientific terror. He was heckling his own colleagues from the balcony as Statler. Yet, when the recording light switched off and Hunt walked out of the London studios where the show was filmed, he was just another face on the street. No paparazzi chased him. No fans asked for his autograph. He possessed the influence of a major Hollywood star with none of the public recognition. For a man with an ego and a personality as massive as Hunt's, this anonymity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it allowed him a profound degree of personal freedom. He could explore the vibrant, rapidly expanding gay culture of New York and London without fear of immediate tabloid exposure. He was openly gay within his inner circle of friends and colleagues at the Jim Henson Company. Henson himself, along with the core team, fostered a surprisingly progressive, tightly knit, and fiercely protective work environment. Behind closed doors, Hunt did not have to hide his sexuality from the people he worked with. But the entertainment industry at large was a different beast entirely. The corporate reality of the late 1970s and early 1980s was absolute. You were dealing with an industry built on the foundation of the morals clause. The Muppets were no longer just a television program. They were a licensing empire. They sold lunchboxes, pajamas, educational toys, and feature films. They were the gold standard of family entertainment. In the boardrooms of television networks and film studios, there was a rigid, unspoken rule. The people selling innocence to children could not, under any circumstances, possess a personal life that middle America might deem controversial. In 1980, being an openly gay man was not just a controversy. It was considered commercial suicide. If the press or the public discovered that the man making their children laugh every morning was gay, the executives feared an instantaneous and catastrophic boycott. Hunt understood the rules of the game. He was highly intelligent and deeply pragmatic. He knew that to keep the career he loved, he had to accept a non-negotiable term of employment. His public persona had to be entirely sterilized. He was forced to construct a thick, impenetrable wall between the man he actually was and the characters he brought to life. He was allowed to be brilliant, funny, and indispensable, but he was strictly forbidden from being authentic. It was within this pressure cooker of forced public celibacy that Hunt found the great love of his life. His name was Kenneth Nelson Bird. Kenneth was a painter, a creative spirit who moved in the same artistic circles in New York. Where Hunt was loud, kinetic, and overwhelming, Kenneth offered a grounding presence. They built a life together in Manhattan. For a brief window in the early 1980s, Hunt had managed to carve out a precarious balance. He had a deeply fulfilling creative career, working on Henson's new, ambitious project Fraggle Rock, where he voiced characters like Junior Gorg and Gunji, and he had a stable, loving partnership at home. Then, the world shifted on its axis. In the summer of 1981, the New York Times published a small, easily overlooked article about a rare cancer appearing in homosexual men in New York and San Francisco. It was the first public whisper of a nightmare that was about to decimate an entire generation. Before it was even named AIDS, the virus was a ghost moving through the community. It struck with terrifying speed and total devastation. Young, healthy men were suddenly developing aggressive pneumonias, rare skin cancers, and neurological collapse. Because the disease initially appeared to primarily affect gay men, the response from the government, the medical establishment, and the general public was a toxic mixture of apathy and active hostility. It was branded a moral failing, a plague sent to punish the marginalized. Hunt and Kenneth were living at ground zero of the epidemic. The vibrant, liberated New York they had known transformed into a hospice. They watched their friends vanish, succumbing to a disease that society barely wanted to acknowledge. The fear was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The psychological toll this took on Hunt is almost impossible to quantify. He was living a split existence of unimaginable extreme. During the day, he would go to the studio. He would contort his body under a table, thrust his arm into the air, and channel pure, unadulterated comedy. He had to be quick, sharp, and flawlessly funny. He had to make Beaker squeak with comedic panic. He had to make Scooter rush around with wide-eyed innocence. He was generating joy on an industrial scale. At night, he would return to a community gripped by panic, attending funerals for men in their 20s and 30s, watching the people he loved waste away. The brutal reality of this double life snapped into sharp focus when Kenneth became sick. When the virus came for Kenneth, there were no effective treatments. An HIV diagnosis in the early 1980s was an absolute death sentence, usually accompanied by intense physical suffering and severe social ostracization. Hunt became a caregiver, watching the man he loved deteriorate day by day. Yet the relentless machinery of Hollywood did not stop. Production schedules on Fraggle Rock and various Muppet films were punishing. Hunt could not simply take a leave of absence to care for his dying partner without raising questions that the studio desperately wanted to avoid. He was trapped in the closet by his own success. He had to leave Kenneth's bedside, go to a sound stage, put on a smiling foam mask, and entertain millions of children. The sheer mental fortitude required to compartmentalize that level of trauma, to hold the hand of your dying partner at night and sing cheerful songs as a puppet the next morning, is staggering. The entertainment industry demanded his labor, but it structurally denied him his humanity. In 1985, Kenneth Nelson Bird died. He was only 31 years old. If a straight actor on a massive television show loses their spouse, the machinery of Hollywood stops to offer condolences. There are press releases, public statements of support, and a collective outpouring of grief. The performer is given the grace to mourn. Richard Hunt was granted none of this. Because Kenneth was a man and because he died of AIDS, his death had to be erased from Hunt's public narrative. The executives at the studio knew what had happened, and his colleagues mourned alongside him in private. But publicly, total silence was enforced. The brand had to be protected. Hunt was not allowed to be a grieving widower. He was not allowed to explain to his fans why his heart was broken. He was expected to swallow the trauma, keep his mouth shut, and get back to work. He packed up Kenneth's life quietly, scattered his ashes in a canal in Venice, a city they had loved, and then he went back to the studio. He put his arm back up in the air. He made the puppets talk. He made the world laugh. He did this while carrying a secret that was even heavier than the grief of losing Kenneth. Richard Hunt had also been tested. He too was carrying the virus. To return to work after burying the man you love is a uniquely brutal human experience. To return to work knowing that the exact same illness that killed him is now coursing through your own veins is a psychological horror that defies easy description. In 1985, when Richard Hunt received his own HIV-positive diagnosis, there was no cocktail of antiretroviral drugs to manage the virus. A ZT, the first heavily toxic and partially effective treatment, was still years away from widespread use. A positive test result in the mid-1980s was not a chronic condition to be managed. It was an absolute, terrifying, and rapidly approaching death sentence. Hunt was 34 years old. He was at the absolute zenith of his career. The Muppet franchise was a global behemoth, having successfully transitioned from television to massive theatrical feature films. The Muppets Take Manhattan had just cemented their status as silver screen icons. Fraggle Rock was a massive hit on HBO, pushing the boundaries of what children's television could achieve in terms of world building and moral complexity. Hunt was indispensable. He was the chaotic, brilliant engine driving a significant portion of the Henson Company's output. Yet, as he stared down the barrel of his own mortality, the isolating nature of his industry clamped down on him like a vice. The executives managing the Muppet empire were not blind. In the tight-knit world of the Henson workshop, secrets were hard to keep, and the ravages of the AIDS epidemic were tearing through the New York theatrical and artistic communities at an apocalyptic pace. The upper management knew what Hunt was facing, but compassion in the corporate world of the 1980s came with strict, unyielding conditions. This is where the polished, family-friendly facade of Hollywood reveals its coldest mechanics. There was an unspoken, ironclad agreement placed upon Hunt. He would be allowed to continue working, he would keep his health insurance, and his immediate colleagues would support him privately. In exchange, he had to become a ghost in his own life. The fear among the network executives and financial backers was palpable. If the press caught wind that one of the primary Muppeteers, the voice of Scooter, the energetic soul of children's morning television, was a gay man dying of AIDS, the resulting scandal would destroy the brand. Middle America in the 1980s was gripped by a toxic, homophobic panic fueled by misinformation. The executives believed, perhaps correctly for the era, that parents would boycott the characters, pull the toys from the shelves, and bankrupt the company out of sheer moral hysteria. So, a chilling crisis management strategy was deployed. Total erasure. Hunt was effectively forced into a gag order regarding his own life. He was denied the fundamental human right to seek public support, to advocate for research, or even to openly explain his rapidly declining physical state. He had to absorb the terror of his diagnosis in complete silence, protecting the financial interests of a billion-dollar empire, while his own body began to fail him. The sheer physical athleticism required to be a core Muppeteer reveals the true cruelty of this arrangement. This was not voice acting in a padded, air-conditioned booth. Puppetry on the Henson sets was a grueling endurance sport. Performers were routinely crammed into trenches cut into the studio floor, or folded underneath heavy wooden tables for hours on end. They had to hold their arms extended straight above their heads, supporting puppets that often weighed several pounds, while staring at tiny television monitors by their feet to ensure their eye lines match the camera lenses. They breathed in the dust from the felt and foam, sweating profusely under the intense heat of heavy studio lighting. It was a job that routinely destroyed the shoulders, backs, and joints of perfectly healthy performers. Now place a man with a severely compromised immune system into that environment. As the virus began to take its toll, Hunt's legendary boundless energy started to drain. The man who used to bounce off the walls of the workshop, playing loud music and playing pranks on Frank Oz and Jim Henson, found himself fighting just to keep his arm elevated for a 3-minute take. The fatigue associated with early-stage AIDS is not merely feeling tired. It is a bone-deep cellular exhaustion, night sweats, persistent infections, and a terrifying vulnerability to common colds made every day on set a physical battle. Yet, he pushed through with a stubborn, almost aggressive resilience. Work was his only remaining anchor. If he stopped performing, he would be left alone in his Manhattan apartment, with nothing but his grief for Kenneth and his fear of his own impending death. The studio, despite its oppressive demand for secrecy, was still his sanctuary. The people under the tables with him, Henson, Oz, Jerry Nelson, Dave Goelz, were his true family. During this dark period, the dichotomy between Hunt's internal reality and his external output reached an agonizing peak. Consider the character of Beaker. Beaker's entire comedic premise is that he is trapped in a laboratory, subjected to horrifying experiments by Dr. Bunsen Honeydew, and completely unable to articulate his terror to the outside world. He just squeaks, panics, and inevitably gets blown up or electrocuted to the roaring laughter of the audience. In the late 1980s, the man providing those panicked squeaks was living his own medical nightmare, trapped in a different kind of laboratory, unable to articulate his terror to the outside world because of a corporate mandate. The audience laughed until they cried, completely oblivious to the fact that the performer was channeling a very real, very present sense of panic. Similarly, Hunt continued to voice Scooter, the eternal optimist, the kid who always believed the show would go on, no matter how badly things were falling apart backstage. Hunt forced himself to summon that bright, youthful, energetic voice, even as his own youth was being aggressively stripped away by a terminal illness. He knew his time was running out. The reality of AIDS in the late 80s left no room for false hope. Realizing his physical limitations were increasing, Hunt began a quiet, desperate pivot to ensure his legacy and the survival of the characters he loved. If he could no longer hold the puppets up for 12 hours a day, he would step behind the camera. Henson, recognizing Hunt's brilliant mind for pacing and visual comedy, encouraged him to direct. Hunt began directing episodes of Fraggle Rock. It allowed him to stay intimately involved in the creative process without the sheer physical agony of performing. He proved to be a natural director, fiercely protective of the performers, because he knew exactly how much they were suffering under the floorboards. But more importantly, he began to subtly mentor the younger generation of puppeteers who were coming up through the ranks. He recognized talent in young performers like David Rudman and Steve Whitmire. Without ever making a grand tragic speech about his own mortality, Hunt began showing them the ropes. He taught them the specific wrist snaps required to make a puppet look surprised. He explained the precise psychological motivations behind characters that on the surface just looked like bits of foam. He was secretly preparing them for the inevitable. He was quietly handing over the keys to his kingdom, ensuring that when his body finally gave out, the children watching at home would never notice a break in the illusion. He was engineering his own seamless replacement so that the billion-dollar machine of joy would not lose a single dollar, even as it cost him his life. By the late 1980s, the atmosphere within the Jim Henson Company was undergoing a seismic structural shift. The freewheeling, rebellious energy of the 1970s that had birthed the Muppet Show was being replaced by the cold, heavy realities of corporate consolidation. Jim Henson, the quiet visionary who had built an empire from foam and felt, was exhausted. He was an artist, not a ruthless businessman, and the sheer administrative weight of running a global licensing and production behemoth was destroying his desire to create. Consequently, Henson entered into highly secretive, high-stakes negotiations to sell his company and his beloved characters to the ultimate titan of family entertainment, the Walt Disney Company. For Richard Hunt, this corporate maneuvering could not have come at a worse time. A potential acquisition by Disney meant the company was under a microscope. Every financial ledger, every production schedule, and every key asset was being scrutinized by executives whose entire business model relied on aggressive, unblemished wholesomeness. If the existing network executives were terrified of an AIDS scandal, the Disney machinery would have found it downright radioactive. The pressure on Hunt to maintain his silence regarding his HIV status was no longer just a matter of protecting a television show. It was about protecting a multi-million-dollar corporate merger. He was a foundational asset in the portfolio Henson was trying to sell. If Hunt fell publicly, the valuation of the entire Muppet brand could plummet. He was trapped in an impossible paradox. As the Disney executives walked the halls of the New York workshop in their sharp suits, evaluating the intellectual property, Hunt was quite literally fighting for his life. The medical reality of AIDS in 1989 was a landscape of relentless compounding horrors. Because the virus systematically dismantles the immune system, patients did not simply fade away. They were battered by a succession of opportunistic infections that a healthy body would easily swat aside. Hunt was dealing with chronic fatigue, brutal weight loss, and the constant terrifying threat of pneumonia or Kaposi's sarcoma. His body, which had always been his primary instrument of comedy, a loud kinetic machine that could contort under tables and project limitless energy, was now actively betraying him. Yet the core group of Muppeteers, Frank Oz, Jerry Nelson, Dave Goelz, and Henson himself, formed a fiercely protective human shield around Hunt. They knew exactly how sick he was. They saw the sheer physical agony it took for him to elevate his arm and snap the jaw of a puppet for a single take. In an industry that usually operates on cutthroat ambition, the Muppet Workshop operated more like a foxhole. When Hunt was too weak to perform the grueling physical manipulation of a character, another puppeteer would silently step in to handle the body, while Hunt provided the voice from a chair just off camera. They covered for him. They hid his declining stamina from the suits, adjusting shooting schedules, and running interference so that the front office only saw the finished, flawless product. The camaraderie was profound, born out of a shared understanding that they were protecting not just their colleague, but their brother from a corporate world that would discard him the second he became a liability. But no amount of loyalty could stop the clock. Hunt was living on borrowed time, operating under the assumption that he would be the first of their tight-knit family to die. He was mentally preparing his colleagues for his own departure, and then the universe delivered a completely unthinkable, devastating blow. In May 1990, Jim Henson, the invincible protective father figure of the Muppet universe, began to complain of a sore throat. He was a notorious workaholic, a man who consistently ignored his own physical discomfort in service of the project. He pushed through the pain, delaying medical treatment until it was far too late. It was not AIDS. It was an aggressive, rapidly moving bacterial infection, Streptococcus pneumonia. Within days of his initial symptoms, Henson was rushed to a New York hospital in critical condition. His organs began to fail. On the 16th of May, 1990, at the age of 53, Jim Henson died. The shockwave that hit the entertainment world was absolute. For the public, it was the sudden, incomprehensible loss of a cultural titan. For Richard Hunt, it was a psychological annihilation. Henson was the man who had taken a chance on a loud, inexperienced kid from New Jersey. Henson had given him his career, his artistic voice, and his protective sanctuary. Now, the man who was supposed to eulogize Hunt was suddenly gone. The contrast in how the world responded to Henson's death versus the silent agony of the AIDS epidemic provides one of the most glaring, uncomfortable historical realities of the era. When Jim Henson died of a bacterial infection, the global machinery of mourning activated immediately. The news-anchored evening broadcasts around the world. Major publications stopped their presses to run massive multi-page retrospectives. It was a socially acceptable tragedy. He was a straight, wealthy, universally beloved man, struck down by a random act of medical misfortune. The public was permitted, even encouraged, to pour out their grief. Meanwhile, a few blocks away in Manhattan, gay men exactly like Richard Hunt were dying by the thousands from a virus that the government was actively ignoring. Their deaths dismissed as a shameful consequence of their own identities. Hunt had to watch the world rightly venerate his mentor, while knowing with absolute certainty that his own impending death would be handled with embarrassed silence and corporate damage control. The hypocrisy was suffocating. On the 21st of May, 1990, a massive public memorial service was held for Jim Henson at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. It remains one of the most surreal and heartbreaking events in television history. Thousands of people packed the cathedral, with thousands more spilling out onto the streets. The core Muppeteers, shattered by grief, were required to perform. They were expected to utilize the very characters Henson had created to say goodbye to him. Richard Hunt, heavily burdened by his own advancing illness, had to summon the physical and emotional strength to perform under the soaring arches of the cathedral. During the service, the Muppeteers gathered at the altar. They raised their puppets above their heads, an act that was becoming agonizingly difficult for Hunt. He operated Scooter. He brought out Statler. Alongside his colleagues, he sang a devastating rendition of Henson's favorite song, Just One Person. Look closely at the archival footage of that performance. The puppets are singing a message of unity and love, but the illusion is intentionally broken. You can see the performers beneath the characters, their faces etched with absolute devastation, tears streaming down their faces as they sing. For Richard Hunt, the psychological weight of that moment is almost too immense to comprehend. He was a man carrying a terminal diagnosis, standing in a cathedral, singing a public farewell to the healthy man who had built his entire world. He was mourning the loss of his greatest protector, knowing that the corporate shield Henson had provided was now gone, and that his own battle with the virus was entering its final brutal stage. He walked out of that cathedral not just without his mentor, but completely untethered, facing a terrifying, rapidly approaching end, entirely alone in the blinding spotlight of the entertainment industry. The aftermath of Jim Henson's sudden death in May 1990 plunged the Muppet universe into an unprecedented state of shock and corporate paralysis. For decades, the Jim Henson Company had operated less like a traditional Hollywood studio and more like an eccentric, fiercely loyal family with Henson as the undisputed patriarch. He was the creative engine, the financial shield, and the moral center. When he vanished overnight, the structural integrity of the entire operation began to buckle. For Richard Hunt, Henson's passing was not just the loss of a mentor, it was the collapse of his primary safety net. The timing was catastrophic. Henson had been in the final complex stages of selling his company to the Walt Disney Company. When he died, the deal immediately fractured. What followed was a bitter, protracted legal and financial battle between Henson's heirs and the Disney Corporation. The workshop in New York transformed from a playground of chaotic creativity into a tense, heavily scrutinized corporate battleground. Lawyers, executives, and accountants scoured the company's assets, trying to determine what the Muppets were actually worth without the man who had created them. And right in the middle of this high-stakes corporate limbo was Richard Hunt, a man whose physical body was actively failing him. By the latter half of 1990, Hunt's battle with AIDS had entered its most brutal, undeniable phase. The virus had systematically dismantled his immune system. In the early 90s, the medical protocol for HIV was still largely defined by heavy toxic doses of AZT, a drug that often felt as punishing as the disease itself. It caused severe anemia, nausea, and crushing fatigue. Hunt was not just fighting the virus, he was fighting the treatment. The physical deterioration became impossible to hide. The man who had once been a towering kinetic force of nature, a performer who would literally bounce off the walls to get a laugh from his colleagues, was now wasting away. His frame grew skeletal, his legendary energy evaporated, replaced by a deep cellular exhaustion that made simply standing up a monumental effort. Yet, the demand for the product did not stop. The Muppets were still a massive commercial entity, and the corporate machinery, now rudderless and panicked, demanded that the remaining core performers step up to fill the void left by Henson. Hunt, driven by a complex mixture of loyalty to his late friend, financial necessity, and a stubborn refusal to let the disease dictate his worth, forced himself back to work. The psychological dissonance of this period is staggering. Outside the walls of the workshop, the AIDS epidemic was ravaging the country. In New York City, activist groups like ACEP were staging massive, desperate protests, throwing the ashes of their dead onto the lawns of the White House to force the government to acknowledge the crisis. The gay community was screaming for its life. Inside the studio, Hunt was mandated to remain completely silent. The family-friendly brand still required total sterilization. He was dying of a disease that the culture at large viewed with toxic disgust, yet his job required him to be the primary vessel for innocent, untainted joy. He returned to the sound stages to perform, but the physical mechanics of puppetry, which he had mastered so brilliantly in his 20s, now became instruments of torture. To operate a core Muppet character requires an intense level of upper body strength and cardiovascular endurance. The performer must maintain a rigid, unnatural posture, holding their arms straight up in the air for minutes at a time, while contorting their hand to deliver precise lip sync. They are crammed into tight, claustrophobic spaces, staring at a small monitor to gauge their performance, while heavy studio lights beat down on them. For a man with advanced AIDS, this environment was a living hell. Hunt would arrive on set exhausted. Between takes, he would collapse into a chair, gasping for air, his body trembling from the effort of simply holding the puppet aloft. The opportunistic infections that ravaged his system meant he was constantly battling respiratory issues, fevers, and chronic pain. But the moment the director called action, a deeply ingrained, almost supernatural muscle memory took over. Hunt would thrust his arm into the air, stare at the monitor, and channel the characters. He still had to be Scooter. He had to summon the bright, eager, fast-talking cadence of a teenage gopher who had his entire life ahead of him. The agonizing irony of a dying man forcing his deteriorating vocal cords to project the sound of eternal youth is profound. He had to be a Beaker, delivering high-pitched, frantic squeaks of panic. He had to be Statler, the cynical old man in the balcony. Hunt was barely 40 years old, but his body was failing him faster than the elderly character he operated. His colleagues, Frank Oz, Jerry Nelson, and Dave Goulds, watched this agonizing process with a mixture of awe and profound grief. The tight-knit fraternity of the core performers closed ranks around him tighter than ever before. They understood the physical cost of every single syllable he uttered on camera. When the physical manipulation became too much for him to bear, the production methods were quietly, seamlessly altered. Hunt would sit in a chair, hidden off camera, providing the vocal performance while another puppeteer handled the physical blocking. The studio executives only cared about the final image on the screen. They didn't need to know how it was achieved. The brotherhood of performers shielded Hunt's physical decline from the corporate suits, allowing him to retain his dignity and his paycheck for as long as humanly possible. But Hunt was a realist. He possessed a sharp, unsentimental intelligence. He knew his body was shutting down, and he knew that the billion-dollar machine of the Muppets would not stop when his heart did. The characters had to outlive him. The brand demanded immortality. This realization prompted one of the most heartbreaking, unsung acts of Hunt's career, the deliberate, systematic transfer of his own soul. He knew he had to train his replacements. He had to teach other men how to be him. He began working closely with younger puppeteers, primarily David Rudman and Steve Whitmire. Whitmire had already been tasked with the impossible job of taking over Kermit the Frog after Henson's death. Now, Hunt was preparing them to take over his stable of characters. This was not a formal corporate handover. It was an intimate, agonizing process of artistic inheritance. Hunt would sit with the younger performers, his breathing shallow, and explain the precise mechanics of his characters. He didn't just teach them the voices, he taught them the psychology. He explained that Scooter wasn't just an annoying kid with a clipboard. He was a survivor who desperately wanted to belong to the chaos. He explained the exact wrist flick required to make Beaker look genuinely terrified rather than just surprised. He taught them the rhythmic cadence of Statler's insults. Imagine the psychological weight of this task. Hunt was actively participating in his own professional erasure. He was watching younger, healthier men put their hands into the very creations that had defined his entire adult life. He was ensuring that when he died, the audience would not notice his absence. He was a craftsman meticulously polishing the tools that would be used to replace him, ensuring the corporate machine wouldn't lose a single cent in revenue. By late 1991, the Disney-Henson negotiations, which had stalled for over a year, resulted in a massive final project for the core team, Muppet Vision 3D, a major theme park attraction for Walt Disney World in Florida. It was one of the last projects Jim Henson had actively developed before his death, and the remaining performers were determined to finish it. It required Hunt to return to the recording booth. The irony was glaring. The Walt Disney Company was the global epicenter of sanitized, heavily policed family entertainment. Their brand identity was predicated on aggressive wholesomeness. And here was Richard Hunt, a gay man in the terminal stages of AIDS, secretly recording the voices that would echo through their theme parks for the next 30 years. He summoned the last reserves of his legendary energy. He recorded the manic panic of Beaker, the youthful eagerness of Scooter, and the biting sarcasm of Statler. The performances are flawless. If you listen to the audio track of that attraction today, there is absolutely no indication of the sheer physical agony the performer was enduring. The illusion is perfect. The man is invisible. When the recording sessions for Muppet Vision 3D wrapped, Hunt's physical capabilities had reached their absolute limit. The virus was winning. The protective shield of his colleagues, the sheer willpower of his artistic drive, and the demands of the corporate machine could no longer hold back the medical reality of his condition. He could no longer manipulate the puppets. He could no longer sustain the breath control required for the voices. He had to step away from the monitors, pull his arm out of the felt, and finally surrender to the disease. In the final months of 1991, Richard Hunt retreated from the studio. The bright lights, the chaotic sets, and the relentless pressure to perform were replaced by the quiet, sterile reality of a Manhattan hospital room and his apartment. He was surrounded by his family and the tight-knit circle of Muppeteers who had fought alongside him in the trenches for nearly 2 decades. The silence that the entertainment industry had enforced upon him for his entire career now enveloped his final days. There were no public statements issued by the studio regarding his rapidly deteriorating condition. There were no vigils organized by the networks that had grown rich off his talent. The children who woke up every morning to laugh at Beaker's high-pitched squeaks had absolutely no idea that the man providing the sound was lying in a hospital bed, his body ravaged, waiting for the end. The corporate mandate had succeeded perfectly. The brand remained untarnished. The machinery of joy continued to hum, indifferent to the suffering of the man who had helped build its engine. As 1991 drew to a close and the bleak, freezing winter of 1992 set over New York City, the vibrant, chaotic world of the Muppet Workshop felt light years away from Richard Hunt's reality. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by the brightest colors imaginable, immersed in a universe of primary colored felt, artificial fur, and manufactured optimism. Now his universe had shrunk to the sterile, muted confines of the Cabrini Hospice in Manhattan. The hospice, in the early 1990s, was ground zero for a community being systematically eradicated. The AIDS wards of New York were places of profound, quiet devastation. They were filled with young men, artists, performers, and creators whose bodies had been entirely consumed by a virus that the broader American culture still largely viewed as a moral failing rather than a medical catastrophe. For a man whose defining characteristic was his sheer uncontainable volume, a man who used to kick open studio doors, play his music too loud, and use his booming voice to command the attention of legends like Jim Henson and Frank Oz, the silence of the hospice must have been deafening. Hunt's legendary energy, the kinetic force that had breathed life into Scooter, Beaker, and Statler, was finally extinguished by the relentless progression of the disease. His body, which had endured years of grueling physical contortions under soundstage floorboards, had completely surrendered. On the 7th of January, 1992, Richard Hunt passed away from AIDS-related complications. He was just 40 years old. The moment his heart stopped, the staggering, undeniable hypocrisy of the entertainment industry snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. Unlike the globally televised mourning that brought the world to a standstill for his mentor just 20 months prior, the silence following Hunt's death was a calculated business decision. The corporate towers of family entertainment did not weep. They simply recalibrated. Because Hunt was a gay man who died of a highly stigmatized disease, his passing was treated not as a human tragedy, but as a public relations liability that needed to be contained with cold, embarrassed efficiency. There was no globally televised memorial. There were no sweeping tributes organized by the network executives whose careers had been bolstered by his tireless, physically punishing labor. Because Hunt was a gay man who died of a highly stigmatized disease, his death was deemed a public relations liability. The billion-dollar entities that controlled the Muppet brand, the Henson Family Trust, and the looming presence of the Walt Disney Company preferred to handle his passing with quiet, embarrassed efficiency. The obituaries that did run in the mainstream press were brief and carefully sanitized. Many publications, adhering to the cowardly journalistic standards of the era when dealing with the AIDS crisis, simply stated that he had died of complications from an illness, refusing to name the virus. They stripped him of his truth even in death. They refused to acknowledge that one of the primary architects of American children's television had been killed by the plague that was ravaging the gay community. The industry decided that it was better to erase his identity entirely than to risk letting the acronym AIDS tarnish the squeaky clean, highly profitable legacy of a family-friendly franchise. This is the ultimate betrayal of the corporate entertainment machine. It will extract every ounce of your talent. It will build empires on your physical and emotional labor, but the moment your humanity becomes commercially inconvenient, you are immediately discarded and disavowed. Almost instantaneously, the cold, ruthless mechanics of brand preservation kicked into high gear. The brutal reality of puppetry as a medium is that the character is a physical object that outlives its creator. When a human actor dies, their character usually dies with them, or the role is respectfully retired. But a puppet is an immortal piece of intellectual property. Scooter was just foam, wire, and fleece hanging on a rack in a workshop. Beaker was just a cylinder of fabric. Statler was just a carved face. The day after Richard Hunt died, those puppets were still there waiting to be picked up, and the machine did not hesitate to fill them. The transfer of power, which Hunt had agonizingly helped prepare for in his final months by training younger performers, was executed with chilling speed. The Jim Henson Company, now desperately trying to maintain its valuation and continue its lucrative projects, handed Hunt's characters over to the next generation of puppeteers. David Rudman, Steve Whitmire, and others stepped into the roles. They studied the tapes, they mimicked the vocal cadences, they replicated the precise wrist snaps that Hunt had perfected over 2 decades of grueling trial and error. And to the millions of children watching at home, the illusion held perfectly. When a new Muppet movie was released, Scooter still ran around with his clipboard. Beaker still shrieked in terror when an experiment went wrong. Statler still sat in the balcony and hurled sarcastic insults. The characters did not mourn. The shows did not miss a beat. The revenue streams remained entirely uninterrupted. This was the final devastating triumph of the studio system. They had successfully severed the art from the artist. They had achieved the ultimate corporate goal. They kept the joy, the laughter, and the immense financial profit, while completely erasing the pain, the identity, and the tragic death of the man who had generated it. The children who grew up finding solace in the chaotic innocence of Hunt's characters were actively shielded from the truth. They were never permitted to know that the man who made them laugh until they cried had died in the middle of a horrific epidemic, abandoned by the public-facing machinery of the industry he had helped to build. They were never told that the voice of their childhood belonged to a man who was denied the basic dignity of a public mourning simply because of who he loved and the disease that killed him. The show went on. The cameras kept rolling. The Muppets remained an untouchable beacon of wholesome American entertainment, their legacy completely untarnished by the reality of the hospice room on the 7th of January, 1992. Richard Hunt was gone, replaced by an imitation of his own soul, leaving behind a profound question about the true cost of our entertainment and the moral bankruptcy of the systems that produce it. When the news of Richard Hunt's death finally permeated through the tight-knit circles of the New York theater and puppetry communities in January 1992, there was no public spectacle. There were no televised vigils or massive press conferences. The mourning was intensely private, fiercely guarded by the colleagues and family who had shielded him during his final years. Hunt's final wishes regarding his remains were a profound reflection of the fragmented parallel lives he he had been forced to lead. He requested that his ashes be divided and scattered in 3 distinct locations, each representing a core pillar of his identity. A portion of his ashes was taken back to Gloucester, New Jersey, the quiet, structured suburban town of his childhood, where a loud, hyperactive boy first realized he was too big for the world he was born into. Another portion was scattered in Manhattan, the vibrant, unforgiving, and culturally explosive city that had given him his freedom, his career, and his artistic soul. But the final portion of his ashes was taken across the Atlantic. They were brought to the Grand Canal in Venice, Italy. They were released into the same waters where 7 years prior, Hunt had quietly scattered the ashes of his partner, Kenneth Nelson Bird. In death, away from the blinding studio lights, the restrictive corporate mandates, and the crushing stigma of the American AIDS crisis, the 2 men were finally permitted to be reunited in the open. The immediate historical aftermath of Hunt's death within the Jim Henson Company was defined by a heavy, almost unbearable absence. The studio had to figure out how to continue the legacy without its 2 loudest, most vital engines. Later that same year, the company released The Muppet Christmas Carol. It was the first major feature film produced after the deaths of both Jim Henson and Richard Hunt. Brian Henson, Jim's son, took on the monumental task of directing. The atmosphere on the freezing London sets was heavy with grief. The performers were operating characters that had been handed down to them under the most tragic circumstances imaginable. Steve Whitmire was performing Kermit the Frog. David Rudman was taking on Hunt's legacy. When the film was finally released, it became an instant holiday classic. But for those who knew the truth, the most resonant moment comes at the very end, before the screen fades to black. A simple title card appears, "In loving memory of Jim Henson and Richard Hunt." It was a quiet, fleeting acknowledgement. For the millions of families sitting in cinemas, chewing popcorn and laughing at the singing vegetables, the names were just text on a screen. But for the artists working deep within the Hollywood machine and those who shared his unspoken reality, it was a silent testament to a man who had been erased by the very industry he helped build. The broader historical significance of Richard Hunt's story extends far beyond the realm of puppetry. His life and death serve as a stark, undeniable indictment of how the family entertainment industry commodifies and exploits queer talent. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the empires of family entertainment, from the Jim Henson Company to the Disney Renaissance, were fundamentally reliant on the subversive, brilliant, and deeply emotional artistic output of gay men. Artists like Richard Hunt and famously the Disney lyricist Howard Ashman were the architects of a modern golden age of children's media. They understood how to write about longing, feeling like an outcast, and the desperate search for belonging, because that was their lived reality. The corporate machine gladly took their genius. It took their late nights, their physical pain, and their unparalleled talent to generate billions of dollars in revenue. But the moment their personal lives, specifically their battles with a stigmatized disease, threatened the sterilized, family-friendly brand identity, the machine abandoned them. The industry wanted the magic, but it was terrified of the magicians. Hunt's story exposes a brutal hypocrisy, an entertainment empire that sold unconditional love to children, while forcing its gay creators to die in silence to protect toy sales. Hollywood has since evolved, but that change came far too late for Richard Hunt. Yet his legacy achieved a strange immortality. Corporate executives may own the copyright to the Muppets, but Hunt owns their DNA. Every time Beaker squeaks in terror or Statler hurls an insult from the balcony, Hunt is still in the room. He managed to upload his kinetic, joyful soul into pieces of foam and fleece. Ultimately, his life is a profound testament to human resilience, navigating one of the darkest realities of the 20th century. Hunt responded by relentlessly manufacturing joy. He used his failing body and fading breath to ensure the world still had a reason to laugh. Richard Hunt was far more than a hidden voice behind a curtain. He was a brilliant, deeply loving gay man who fought a terrifying war in total isolation. The greatest tribute we can offer is to finally tear down the wall the industry built around him and let the man who held the puppet step out into the light.